Chapter 4 of The Railway Children. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Railway Children by Edith Nesbit. Chapter 4. The Engine Burglar. What was left of the second sheet and the Brunswick black came in very nicely to make a banner bearing the legend,
"She is nearly well, thank you."
And this was displayed to the Green Dragon about a fortnight after the arrival of the wonderful hamper. The old gentleman saw it, and waved a cheerful response from the train. And when this had been done, the children saw that now was the time when they must tell Mother what they had done when she was ill. And it did not seem nearly so easy as they had thought it would be. But it had to be done, and it was done. Mother was extremely angry. She was seldom angry, and now she was angrier than they had ever known her. This was horrible, but it was much worse when she suddenly began to cry. Crying is catching, I believe, like measles and whooping cough. At any rate, everyone at once found itself taking part in a crying party. Mother stopped first. She dried her eyes, and then she said,
"I'm sorry I was so angry, darlings, because I know you didn't understand."
"We didn't mean to be naughty, Mammy,"
sobbed Bobby, and Peter and Phyllis sniffed.
"Now listen,"
said Mother.
"It's quite true that we're poor, but we have enough to live on. You mustn't go telling everyone about our affairs. It's not right. And you must never, never, never ask strangers to give you things. Now always remember that, won't you?"
They all hugged her and rubbed their damp cheeks against hers and promised that they would.
"And I'll write a letter to your old gentleman, and I shall tell him that I didn't approve. Oh, of course I shall thank him, too, for his kindness. It's you I don't approve of, my darlings, not the old gentleman. He was as kind as ever he could be. And you can give the letter to the station master to give him, and we won't say any more about it."
Afterwards, when the children were alone, Bobby said,
"Isn't Mother splendid? You catch any other grown-up saying they were sorry they had been angry."
"Yes,"
said Peter.
"she is splendid, but it's rather awful when she's angry."
"She's like avenging and bright in the song,"
said Phyllis.
"I should like to look at her if it wasn't so awful. She looks so beautiful when she's really downright furious."
They took the letter down to the station master.
"I thought you said you haven't got any friends except in London,"
said he.
"We've made him since."
said Peter.
"But he doesn't live hereabouts."
"No, we just know him on the railway."
Then the station master retired to that sacred inner temple behind the little window where the tickets are sold, and the children went down to the porter's room and talked to the porter. They learned several interesting things from him, among others that his name was Perks, that he was married and had 3 children, that the lamps in front of engines are called headlights, and the ones at the back tail lights.
"And that just shows,"
whispered Phyllis,
"that trains really are dragons in disguise with proper heads and tails."
It was on this day that the children first noticed that all engines are not alike.
"Alike?"
said the porter, whose name was Perks.
"Lor love you no, miss. No more alike nor what you and me are. That little un without a tender as went by just now, all on her own, that was a tank, that was. She's off to do some shunting t'other side o' Maidbridge. That's as it might be you, miss. Then there's goods engines, great strong things, with 3 wheels each side, joined with rods to strengthen 'em, as it might be me. Then there's main line engines, as it might be this here young gentleman when he grows up and wins all the races at his school, so he will. The main line engine, she's built for speed as well as power. That's one to the 915 up."
"The Green Dragon,"
said Phyllis.
"We calls her the Snail, miss, among ourselves,"
said the porter.
"She's oftener behind nor any train on the line."
"But the engine's green,"
said Phyllis.
"Yes, miss,"
said Perks.
"So's a snail some seasons of the year."
The children agreed as they went home to dinner that the porter was most delightful company. Next day was Roberta's birthday. In the afternoon she was politely but firmly requested to get out of the way and keep there till tea-time.
You aren't to see what we're going to do till it's done. It's a glorious surprise,
said Phyllis, and Roberta went out into the garden all alone. She tried to be grateful, but she felt she would much rather have helped in whatever it was than have to spend her birthday afternoon by herself, no matter how glorious the surprise might be. Now that she was alone, she had time to think, and one of the things she thought of most was what Mother had said in one of those feverish nights when her hands were so hot and her eyes so bright. The words were,
"Ah, what a doctor's bill there'll be for this."
She walked round and round the garden among the rose bushes that hadn't any roses yet, only buds, and the lilac bushes and syringas and American currants, and the more she thought of the doctor's bill, the less she liked the thought of it. And presently she made up her mind. She went out through the side door of the garden and climbed up the steep field to where the road runs along by the canal. She walked along until she came to the bridge that crosses the canal and leads to the village, and here she waited. It was very pleasant in the sunshine to lean one's elbows on the warm stone of the bridge and look down at the blue water of the canal. Bobby had never seen any other canal except the Regent's Canal, and the water of that is not at all a pretty colour, and she had never seen any river at all except the Thames, which also would be all the better if its face was washed. Perhaps the children would have loved the canal as much as the railway, but for two things. One was that they had found the railway first, on that first wonderful morning when the house and the country and the moors and rocks and great hills were all new to them. They had not found the canal till some days later. The other reason was that everyone on the railway had been kind to them. The station master, the porter, and the old gentleman who waved, and the people on the canal were anything but kind. The people on the canal were, of course, the bargees, who steered the slow barges up and down, or walked beside the old horses that trampled up the mud of the towing path and strained at the long tow ropes. Peter had once asked one of the bargees the time, and had been told to "Get out of that!" in a tone so fierce that he did not stop to say anything about his having just as much right on the towing path as the man himself. Indeed, he did not even think of saying it till some time later. Then another day, when the children thought they would like to fish in the canal, a boy in a barge threw lumps of coal at them, and one of these hit Phyllis on the back of the neck. She was just stooping down to tie up her bootlace, and though the coal hardly hurt at all, it made her not care very much about going on fishing. On the bridge, however, Roberta felt quite safe, because she could look down on the canal, and if any boy showed signs of meaning to throw coal, she could duck behind the parapet. Presently there was a sound of wheels, which was just what she expected. The wheels were the wheels of the doctor's dog-cart, and in the cart, of course, was the doctor. He pulled up and called out,
"Hello, head nurse. Want a lift?"
"I wanted to see you,"
said Bobby.
"Your mother's not worse, I hope?"
said the doctor.
"No, but—"
"Well, skip in then and we'll go for a drive."
Roberta climbed in, and the brown horse was made to turn round, which it did not like at all, for it was looking forward to its tea. Its oats.
"This is jolly,"
said Bobby, as the dog-cart flew along the road by the canal.
"We could throw a stone down any one of your 3 chimneys,"
said the doctor as they passed the house.
"Yes,
said Bobby.
but you'd have to be a jolly good shot."
"How do you know I'm not?"
said the doctor.
"Now then, what's the trouble?"
Bobby fidgeted with the hook of the driving apron.
"Come, out with it,"
said the doctor.
"It's rather hard, you see,"
said Bobby.
"to out with it, because of what Mother said."
"What did Mother say?"
She said I wasn't to go telling everyone that we're poor. But you aren't everyone, are you?
Not at all,
said the doctor cheerfully.
Well?
Well, I know doctors are very extravagant. I mean expensive. And Mrs. Vinnie told me that her doctoring only cost her 2pence a week because she belonged to a club.
Yes?
You see, she told me what a good doctor you were, and I asked her how she could afford you, because she's much poorer than we are. I've been in her house, and I know. And then she told me about the club, and I thought I'd ask you, and... Oh, I don't want Mother to be worried. Can't we be in the club too, the same as Mrs. Vinnie?
The doctor was silent. He was rather poor himself, and he had been pleased at getting a new family to attend. So I think his feelings at that minute were rather mixed.
You aren't cross with me, are you?
Said Bobby in a very small voice. The doctor roused himself.
Cross? How could I be? You're a very sensible little woman. Now look here, don't you worry, I'll make it all right with your mother, even if I have to make a special brand new club all for her. Look here, this is where the aqueduct begins.
What's an what's its name?
Asked Bobby.
A water bridge,
said the doctor.
Look.
The road rose to a bridge over the canal. To the left was a steep rocky cliff with trees and shrubs growing in the cracks of the rock, and the canal here left off running along the top of the hill and started to run on a bridge of its own, a great bridge with tall arches that went right across the valley. Bobby drew a long breath.
It is grand, isn't it?
She said.
It's like pictures in the history of Rome.
Right,
said the doctor.
That's just exactly what it is like. The Romans were dead nuts on aqueducts. It's a splendid piece of engineering.
I thought engineering was making engines.
Ah, there are different sorts of engineering. Making roads and bridges and tunnels is one kind, and making fortifications is another. Well, we must be turning back, and remember, you aren't to worry about doctor's bills or you'll be ill yourself, and then I'll send you in a bill as long as the aqueduct.
When Bobby had parted from the doctor at the top of the field that ran down from the road to Three Chimneys, she could not feel that she had done wrong. She knew that Mother would perhaps think differently, but Bobby felt that for once she was the one who was right, and she scrambled down the rocky slope with a really happy feeling. Phyllis and Peter met her at the back door. They were unnaturally clean and neat, and Phyllis had a red bow in her hair. There was only just time for Bobby to make herself tidy and tie up her hair with a blue bow before a little bell rang.
There,
said Phyllis.
That's to show the surprise is ready. Now you wait till the bell rings again, and then you may come into the dining room.
So Bobby waited. Tinkle, tinkle, said the little bell, and Bobby went into the dining room, feeling rather shy. Directly she opened the door, she found herself, as it seemed, in a new world of light and flowers and singing. Mother and Peter and Phyllis were standing in a row at the end of the table. The shutters were shut, and there were 12 candles on the table, one for each of Roberta's years. The table was covered with a sort of pattern of flowers, and at Roberta's place was a thick wreath of forget-me-nots, and several most interesting little packages. And Mother and Phyllis and Peter were singing to the first part of the tune of St. Patrick's Day. Roberta knew that Mother had written the words on purpose for her birthday. It was a little way of Mother's on birthdays. It had begun on Bobby's 4th birthday, when Phyllis was a baby. Bobby remembered learning the verses to say to Father for a surprise. She wondered if Mother had remembered too. The 4-year-old verse had been,
Daddy dear, I'm only 4, and I'd rather not be more. 4's the nicest age to be, 2 and 2, and 1 and 3. What I love is 2 and 2, Mother, Peter, Phil, and you. What you love is 1 and 3, Mother, Peter, Phil, and me. Give your little girl a kiss, because she learned and told you this.
The song the others were singing now went like this.
Our darling Roberta, no sorrow shall hurt her, if we can prevent it her whole life long.
Her birthday's our fete day, we'll make it our great day, and give her our presents and sing her our song.
May pleasure attend her, and may the fates send her the happiest journey along her life's way.
With skies bright above her, and dear ones to love her, dear Bob, many happy returns of the day.
When they had finished singing, they cried,
3 cheers for our Bobby!
And gave them very loudly. Bobby felt exactly as though she were going to cry. You know that odd feeling in the bridge of your nose and the pricking in your eyelids? But before she had time to begin, they were all kissing and hugging her.
Now,
said Mother,
look at your presents.
They were very nice presents. There was a green and red needle book that Phyllis had made herself in secret moments. There was a darling little silver brooch of Mother's, shaped like a buttercup, which Bobby had known and loved for years, but which she had never thought would come to be her very own. There was also a pair of blue glass vases from Mrs. Viney. Roberta had seen and admired them in the village shop. And there were 3 birthday cards with pretty pictures and wishes. Mother fitted the forget-me-not crown on Bobby's brown head.
And now look at the table,
she said. There was a cake on the table covered with white sugar, with Dear Bobby on it, in pink sweets, and there were buns and jam. But the nicest thing was that the big table was almost covered with flowers. Wallflowers were laid all round the tea tray. There was a ring of forget-me-nots round each plate. The cake had a wreath of white lilac round it, and in the middle was something that looked like a pattern all done with single blooms of lilac or wallflower or laburnum.
It's a map of the railway,
cried Peter.
Look, those lilac lines are the metals, and there's the station done in brown wallflowers. The laburnum is the train, and there are the signal boxes and the road up to here. And those fat red daisies are us 3 waving to the old gentleman. That's him, the pansy in the laburnum train.
And there's 3 chimneys done in the purple primroses,
said Phyllis.
And that little tiny rosebud is Mother looking out for us when we're late for tea. Peter invented it all, and we got all the flowers from the station. We thought you'd like it better.
That's my present,
said Peter, suddenly dumping down his adored steam engine on the table in front of her. Its tender had been lined with fresh white paper and was full of sweets.
Oh, Peter,
cried Bobby, quite overcome by this munificence.
Not your own dear little engine that you're so fond of?
Oh, no,
said Peter very promptly.
Not the engine, only the sweets.
Bobby couldn't help her face changing a little, not so much because she was disappointed at not getting the engine, as because she had thought it so very noble of Peter, and now she felt she had been silly to think it. Also, she felt she must have seemed greedy to expect the engine as well as the sweets, so her face changed. Peter saw it. He hesitated a minute, then his face changed too, and he said,
I mean, not all the engine. I'll let you go halves if you like.
You're a brick,
cried Bobby.
It's a splendid present.
She said no more aloud, but to herself she said,
That was awfully jolly decent of Peter, because I know he didn't mean to. Well, the broken half shall be my half of the engine, and I'll get it mended and give it back to Peter for his birthday. Yes, Mother dear, I should like to cut the cake,
she added, and tea began. It was a delightful birthday. After tea, Mother played games with them, any game they liked. Their first choice was Blind Man's Buff, in the course of which Bobby's forget-me-not wreath twisted itself crookedly over one of her ears and stayed there. Then, when it was near bedtime and time to calm down, Mother had a lovely new story to read to them.
You won't sit up late working, will you, Mother?
Bobby asked as they said good night. And Mother said no, she wouldn't. She would only write to Father and then go to bed. But when Bobby crept down later to bring up her presents, for she felt she really could not be separated from them all night, Mother was not writing, but leaning her head on her arms and her arms on the table. I think it was rather good of Bobby to slip quietly away, saying over and over,
She doesn't want me to know she's unhappy, and I won't know. I won't know.
But it made a sad end to the birthday. The very next morning, Bobby began to watch her opportunity to get Peter's engine mended secretly, and the opportunity came the very next afternoon. Mother went by train to the nearest town to do shopping. When she went there, she always went to the post office, perhaps to post her letters to father, for she never gave them to the children or Mrs. Viney to post, and she never went to the village herself. Peter and Phyllis went with her. Bobby wanted an excuse not to go, but try as she would, she couldn't think of a good one. And just when she felt that all was lost, her frock caught on a big nail by the kitchen door, and there was a great criss-cross tear all along the front of the skirt. I assure you this was really an accident. So the others pitied her and went without her, for there was no time for her to change, because they were rather late already and had to hurry to the station to catch the train. When they had gone, Bobby put on her everyday frock and went down to the railway. She did not go into the station, but she went along the line to the end of the platform, where the engine is when the down train is alongside the platform, the place where there are a water tank and a long limp leather hose, like an elephant's trunk. She hid behind a bush on the other side of the railway. She had the toy engine done up in brown paper, and she waited patiently with it under her arm. Then, when the next train came in and stopped, Bobby went across the metals of the up line and stood beside the engine. She had never been so close to an engine before. It looked much larger and harder than she had expected, and it made her feel very small indeed, and somehow very soft, as if she could very, very easily be hurt rather badly.
I know what silkworms feel like now,
said Bobby to herself. The engine driver and fireman did not see her. They were leaning out on the other side, telling the porter a tale about a dog and a leg of mutton.
If you please,
said Roberta, but the engine was blowing off steam and no one heard her.
If you please, Mr. Engineer.
She spoke a little louder, but the engine happened to speak at the same moment, and of course Roberta's soft little voice hadn't a chance. It seemed to her that the only way would be to climb on to the engine and pull at their coats. The step was high, but she got her knee on it and clambered into the cab. She stumbled and fell on hands and knees on the base of the great heap of coals that led up to the square opening in the tender. The engine was not above the weaknesses of its fellows. It was making a great deal more noise than there was the slightest need for, and just as Roberta fell on the coals, the engine driver, who had turned without seeing her, started the engine, and when Bobby had picked herself up, the train was moving. Not fast, but much too fast for her to get off. All sorts of dreadful thoughts came to her all together in one horrible flash. There were such things as express trains that went on, she supposed, for hundreds of miles without stopping. Suppose this should be one of them. How would she get home again? She had no money to pay for the return journey.
And I've no business here. I'm an engine burglar, that's what I am,
she thought.
I shouldn't wonder if they could lock me up for this.
And the train was going faster and faster. There was something in her throat that made it impossible for her to speak. She tried twice. The men had their backs to her. They were doing something to things that looked like taps. Suddenly she put out her hand and caught hold of the nearest sleeve. The man turned with a start, and he and Roberta stood for a minute, looking at each other in silence. Then the silence was broken by them both. The man said,
"Here's a bloomin' go,"
and Roberta burst into tears. The other man said he was blooming well blessed, or something like it, but though naturally surprised, they were not exactly unkind.
"You're a naughty little girl, that's what you are,"
said the fireman, and the engine driver said,
"Daring little piece, I call her."
But they made her sit down on an iron seat in the cab, and told her to stop crying and tell them what she meant by it. She did stop as soon as she could. One thing that helped her was the thought that Peter would give almost his ears to be in her place, on a real engine, really going. The children had often wondered whether any engine driver could be found noble enough to take them for a ride on an engine, and now there she was. She dried her eyes and sniffed earnestly.
"Now then,"
said the fireman.
Out with it. What do you mean by it, eh?
Oh, please.
sniffed Bobby.
Try again,
said the engine driver encouragingly. Bobby tried again.
Please, Mr. Engineer.
She said.
I did call out to you from the line, but you didn't hear me, and I just climbed up to touch you on the arm. Quite gently I meant to do it, and then I fell into the coals, and I'm so sorry if I frightened you. Oh, don't be cross. Oh, please don't.
She sniffed again.
We ain't so much cross,
said the fireman,
as interested like. It ain't every day a little girl tumbles into our coal bunker out of the sky, is it, Bill? What did you do it for, eh?
That's the point,
agreed the engine driver.
What did you do it for?
Bobby found that she had not quite stopped crying. The engine driver patted her on the back and said,
Here, cheer up, mate. It ain't so bad as all that air, I'll be bound.
I wanted,
said Bobby, much cheered to find herself addressed as mate.
I only wanted to ask you if you'd be so kind as to mend this.
She picked up the brown paper parcel from among the coals and undid the string with hot red fingers that trembled. Her feet and legs felt the scorch of the engine fire, but her shoulders felt the wild chill rush of the air. The engine lurched and shook and rattled, and as they shot under a bridge, the engine seemed to shout in her ears. The fireman shovelled on coals. Bobby unrolled the brown paper and disclosed the toy engine.
I thought,
she said wistfully,
that perhaps you'd mend this for me, because you're an engineer, you know.
The engine driver said he was blowed if he wasn't blessed.
I'm blessed if I ain't blowed,
remarked the fireman. But the engine driver took the little engine and looked at it, and the fireman ceased for an instant to shovel coal, and looked too.
It's like your precious cheek,
said the engine driver.
Whatever made you think we'd bother tinkering penny toys?
I didn't mean it for precious cheek,
said Bobby.
Only everybody that has anything to do with railways is so kind and good, I didn't think you'd mind. You don't really, do you?
She added, for she had seen a not unkindly wink pass between the two.
My trade's driving of an engine, not mending her, especially such a outsizing engines as this here,
said Bill.
And how we going to get you back to your sorrowing friends and relations, and all be forgiven and forgotten?
If you'll put me down next time you stop,
said Bobby firmly, though her heart beat fiercely against her arm as she clasped her hands.
And lend me the money for a third-class ticket, I'll pay you back, honour bright. I'm not a confidence trick like in the newspapers. Really, I'm not.
You're a little lady every inch,
said Bill, relenting suddenly and completely.
We'll see you gets home safe. And about this engine, Jim, ain't you got ne'er a pal as can use a soldering iron? Seems to me that's about all the little bounder wants doing to it.
That's what Father said,
Bobby explained eagerly.
What's that for?
She pointed to a little brass wheel that he had turned as he spoke.
That's the injector.
In what?
Injector to fill up the boiler.
Oh,
said Bobby, mentally registering the fact to tell the others.
That is interesting.
This ere's an automatic brake,
Bill went on, flattered by her enthusiasm.
You just move this ere little handle, do it with one finger, you can, and the train jolly soon stops. That's what they call the power of silence in the newspaper.
He showed her two little dials like clock faces, and told her how one showed how much steam was going, and the other showed if the brake was working properly. By the time she had seen him shut off steam with a big shining steel handle, Bobby knew more about the inside working of an engine than she had ever thought there was to know, and Jim had promised that his second cousin's wife's brother should solder the toy engine, or Jim would know the reason why. Besides all the knowledge she had gained, Bobby felt that she and Bill and Jim were now friends for life, and that they had wholly and forever forgiven her for stumbling uninvited among the sacred coals of their tender. At Stackpool Junction she parted from them with warm expressions of mutual regard. They handed her over to the guard of a returning train, a friend of theirs, and she had the joy of knowing what guards do in their secret fastnesses, and understood how, When you pull the communication cord in railway carriages, a wheel goes round under the guard's nose, and a loud bell rings in his ears. She asked the guard why his van smelt so fishy, and learned that he had to carry a lot of fish every day, and that the wetness in the hollows of the corrugated floor had all drained out of boxes full of plaice and cod and mackerel and soles and smelts. Bobby got home in time for tea, and she felt as though her mind would burst with all that had been put into it since she parted from the others. How she blessed the nail that had torn her frock.
Where have you been?
Asked the others.
To the station, of course,
Said Roberta, but she would not tell a word of her adventures till the day appointed when she mysteriously led them to the station at the hour of the 3:19's transit, and proudly introduced them to her friends, Bill and Jim. Jim's second cousin's wife's brother had not been unworthy of the sacred trust reposed in him. The toy engine was literally as good as new.
"Goodbye, oh, goodbye,"
said Bobby, just before the engine screamed its goodbye.
"I shall always, always love you, and Jim's second cousin's wife's brother as well."
And as the three children went home up the hill, Peter hugging the engine, now quite its own self again, Bobby told with joyous leaps of the heart the story of how she had been an engine burglar. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5 of The Railway Children. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Railway Children by Edith Nesbit. Chapter 5. Prisoners and Captives. It was one day when Mother had gone to Maidbridge. She had gone alone, but the children were to go to the station to meet her, and, loving the station as they did, it was only natural that they should be there a good hour before there was any chance of Mother's train arriving, even if the train were punctual, which was most unlikely. No doubt they would have been just as early, even if it had been a fine day and all the delights of woods and fields and rocks and rivers had been open to them. But it happened to be a very wet day and, for July, very cold. There was a wild wind that drove flocks of dark purple clouds across the sky,
Like herds of dream elephants,
as Phyllis said, and the rain stung sharply, so that the way to the station was finished at a run. Then the rain fell faster and harder, and beat slantwise against the windows of the booking office and of the chill place that had General Waiting Room on its door.
It's like being in a besieged castle.
Phyllis said.
Look at the arrows of the foe striking against the battlements.
It's much more like a great garden squirt,
said Peter. They decided to wait on the upside, for the down platform looked very wet indeed, and the rain was driving right into the little bleak shelter where down passengers have to wait for their trains. The hour would be full of incident and of interest, for there would be 2 up trains and 1 down to look at before the one that should bring Mother back.
"Perhaps it'll have stopped raining by then,"
said Bobby.
"Anyhow, I'm glad I brought Mother's waterproof and umbrella."
They went into the desert spot labelled General Waiting Room, and the time passed pleasantly enough in a game of advertisements. You know the game, of course. It is something like Dumb Crambo. The players take it in turns to go out, and then come back and look as like some advertisement as they can, and the others have to guess what advertisement it is meant to be. Bobby came in and sat down under Mother's umbrella and made a sharp face, and everyone knew she was the fox who sits under the umbrella in the advertisement. Phyllis tried to make a magic carpet of Mother's waterproof, but it would not stand out stiff and raft-like as a magic carpet should, and nobody could guess it. Everyone thought Peter was carrying things a little too far, when he blacked his face all over with coal dust and struck a spidery attitude and said he was the blot that advertises somebody's blue-black writing fluid. It was Phyllis's turn again, and she was trying to look like the Sphinx that advertises What's-His-Name's personally conducted tours up the Nile, when the sharp ting of the signal announced the up train. The children rushed out to see it pass. On its engine were the particular driver and fireman who were now numbered among the children's dearest friends. Courtesies passed between them. Jim asked after the toy engine, and Bobby pressed on his acceptance a moist, greasy package of toffee that she had made herself. Charmed by this attention, the engine driver consented to consider her request that some day he would take Peter for a ride on the engine.
"Stand back, mates!"
cried the engine driver suddenly.
"And off she goes!"
And sure enough, off the train went. The children watched the tail lights of the train till it disappeared round the curve of the line, and then turned to go back to the dusty freedom of the general waiting room and the joys of the advertisement game. They expected to see just 1 or 2 people, the end of the procession of passengers who had given up their tickets and gone away. Instead, the platform round the door of the station had a dark blot round it, and the dark blot was a crowd of people.
"Oh!"
cried Peter, with a thrill of joyous excitement.
"Something's happened! Come on!"
They ran down the platform. When they got to the crowd, they could, of course, see nothing but the damp backs and elbows of the people on the crowds outside. Everybody was talking at once. It was evident that something had happened.
"It's my belief he's nothing worse than a natural,"
said a farmerish-looking person. Peter saw his red, clean-shaven face as he spoke.
"If you ask me, I should say it was a police court case,"
said a young man with a black bag.
"Not it. The infirmary, more like."
Then the voice of the station master was heard, firm and official.
"Now then, move along there. I'll attend to this, if you please."
But the crowd did not move, and then came a voice that thrilled the children through and through, for it spoke in a foreign language, and, what is more, it was a language that they had never heard. They had heard French spoken and German. Aunt Emma knew German, and used to sing a song about bedeuten and zeiten and bin and sin. Nor was it Latin. Peter had been in Latin for 4 terms. It was some comfort, anyhow, to find that none of the crowd understood the foreign language any better than the children did.
"What's that he's saying?"
asked the farmer heavily.
"Sounds like French to me,"
said the station master, who had once been to Boulogne for the day.
"It isn't French!"
cried Peter.
What is it then?
asked more than one voice. The crowd fell back a little to see who had spoken, and Peter pressed forward so that when the crowd closed up again, he was in the front rank.
"I don't know what it is,"
said Peter.
"but it isn't French, I know that."
Then he saw what it was that the crowd had for its centre. It was a man, the man, Peter did not doubt, who had spoken in that strange tongue. A man with long hair and wild eyes, with shabby clothes, of a cut Peter had not seen before. A man whose hands and lips trembled, and who spoke again as his eyes fell on Peter.
"No, it's not French,"
said Peter.
"Try him with French if you know so much about it,"
said the farmer man.
"Parlez-vous français?"
began Peter boldly, and the next moment the crowd recoiled again, for the man with the wild eyes had left leaning against the wall and had sprung forward and caught Peter's hands and began to pour forth a flood of words which, though he could not understand a word of them, Peter knew the sound of.
"There,"
said he, and turned, his hands still clasped in the hands of the strange shabby figure, to throw a glance of triumph at the crowd.
"There, that's French."
What does he say?
"I don't know."
Peter was obliged to own it.
"Here,"
said the station master again.
"You move on if you please. I'll deal with this case."
A few of the more timid or less inquisitive travellers moved slowly and reluctantly away, and Phyllis and Bobby got near to Peter. All 3 had been taught French at school. How deeply they now wished that they had learned it. Peter shook his head at the stranger, but he also shook his hands as warmly and looked at him as kindly as he could. A person in the crowd, after some hesitation, said suddenly,
"No comprenny,"
and then, blushing deeply, backed out of the press and went away.
"Take him into your room,"
whispered Bobby to the station master.
"Mother can talk French. She'll be here by the next train from Maidbridge."
The station master took the arm of the stranger, suddenly but not unkindly. But the man wrenched his arm away and cowered back, coughing and trembling and trying to push the station master away.
Oh, don't,
said Bobby.
Don't you see how frightened he is? He thinks you're going to shut him up. I know he does. Look at his eyes.
They're like a fox's eyes when the beast's in a trap,
said the farmer.
Oh, let me try.
Bobby went on.
I do really know 1 or 2 French words, if I could only think of them.
Sometimes, in moments of great need, we can do wonderful things, things that, in ordinary life, we could hardly even dream of doing. Bobby had never been anywhere near the top of her French class, but she must have learned something without knowing it, for now, looking at those wild, hunted eyes, she actually remembered, and, what is more, spoke some French words. She said,
Vous attendre. Ma mère parle français. No, what's the French for being kind?
Nobody knew.
Bon is good,
said Phyllis.
Nous être bon pour vous.
I do not know whether the man understood her words, but he understood the touch of the hand she thrust into his, and the kindness of the other hand that stroked his shabby sleeve. She pulled him gently towards the inmost sanctuary of the station-master. The other children followed, and the station-master shut the door in the face of the crowd, which stood a little while in the booking-office talking and looking at the fast-closed yellow door, and then, by ones and twos, went its way, grumbling. Inside the station-master's room, Bobby still held the stranger's hand and stroked his sleeve.
Here's a go,
said the station-master.
Now ticket. Doesn't even know where he wants to go. I'm not sure now but what I ought to send for the police.
Oh, don't!
All the children pleaded at once, and suddenly Bobby got between the others and the stranger, for she had seen that he was crying. By a most unusual piece of good fortune, she had a handkerchief in her pocket. By a still more uncommon accident, the handkerchief was moderately clean. Standing in front of the stranger, she got out the handkerchief and passed it to him, so that the others did not see.
Wait till Mother comes,
Phyllis was saying.
She does speak French beautifully. You'd just love to hear her.
I'm sure he hasn't done anything like you're sent to prison for,
said Peter.
Looks like without visible means to me,
said the station-master.
Well, I don't mind giving him the benefit of the doubt till your mamma comes. I should like to know what nation's got the credit of him, that I should.
Then Peter had an idea. He pulled an envelope out of his pocket and showed that it was half full of foreign stamps.
Look here,
he said.
Let's show him these.
Bobby looked and saw that the stranger had dried his eyes with her handkerchief, so she said,
All right.
They showed him an Italian stamp, and pointed from him to it and back again, and made signs of question with their eyebrows. He shook his head. Then they showed him a Norwegian stamp, the common blue kind it was, and again he signed no. Then they showed him a Spanish one, and at that he took the envelope from Peter's hand and searched among the stamps with a hand that trembled. The hand that he reached out at last, with a gesture as of one answering a question, contained a Russian stamp.
He's Russian,
cried Peter.
Or else he's like the man who was, in Kipling, you know.
The train from Maidbridge was signalled.
I'll stay with him till you bring Mother in,
said Bobby.
You're not afraid, missy?
Oh, no,
said Bobby, looking at the stranger as she might have looked at a strange dog of doubtful temper.
You wouldn't hurt me, would you?
She smiled at him, and he smiled back, a queer, crooked smile. And then he coughed again, and the heavy rattling swish of the incoming train swept past, and the station-master and Peter and Phyllis went out to meet it. Bobby was still holding the stranger's hand when they came back with Mother. The Russian rose and bowed very ceremoniously. Then Mother spoke in French, and he replied, haltingly at first, but presently in longer and longer sentences. The children, watching his face and Mother's, knew that he was telling her things that made her angry and pitying and sorry and indignant all at once.
Well, Mum, what's it all about?
The station-master could not restrain his curiosity any longer.
Oh,
said Mother.
It's all right. He's a Russian, and he's lost his ticket, and I'm afraid he's very ill. If you don't mind, I'll take him home with me now. He's really quite worn out. I'll run down and tell you all about him tomorrow.
I hope you won't find you're taking home a frozen viper,
said the station master doubtfully.
Oh, no,
Mother said brightly, and she smiled.
I'm quite sure I'm not. Why, he's a great man in his own country. Writes books, beautiful books. I've read some of them. But I'll tell you all about it tomorrow.
She spoke again in French to the Russian, and everyone could see the surprise and pleasure and gratitude in his eyes. He got up and politely bowed to the station-master, and offered his arm most ceremoniously to Mother. She took it, but anybody could have seen that she was helping him along, and not he her.
You girls run home and light the fire in the sitting room,
Mother said.
And Peter had better go for the doctor.
But it was Bobby who went for the doctor.
I hate to tell you,
she said breathlessly, when she came upon him in his shirt-sleeves, weeding his pansy bed.
but Mother's got a very shabby Russian, and I'm sure he'll have to belong to your club. I'm certain he hasn't got any money. We found him at the station.
Found him? Was he lost, then?
Asked the doctor, reaching for his coat.
Yes,
said Bobby unexpectedly.
that's just what he was. He's been telling Mother the sad, sweet story of his life in French, and she said, would you be kind enough to come directly if you were at home? He has a dreadful cough, and he's been crying.
The doctor smiled.
Oh, don't,
said Bobby.
Please don't. You wouldn't if you'd seen him. I never saw a man cry before. You don't know what it's like.
Dr. Forrest wished then that he hadn't smiled. When Bobby and the doctor got to Three Chimneys, the Russian was sitting in the armchair that had been Father's, stretching his feet to the blaze of a bright wood fire, and sipping the tea Mother had made him.
The man seems worn out, mind and body,
was what the doctor said.
The cough's bad, but there's nothing that can't be cured. He ought to go straight to bed, though, and let him have a fire at night.
I'll make one in my room. It's the only one with the fireplace,
said Mother, and presently the doctor helped the stranger to bed. There was a big black trunk in Mother's room that none of the children had ever seen unlocked. Now, when she had lighted the fire, she unlocked it and took some clothes out, men's clothes, and set them to air by the newly lighted fire. Bobby, coming in with more wood for the fire, saw the mark on the nightshirt and looked over to the open trunk. All the things she could see were men's clothes, and the name marked on the shirt was Father's name. Then Father hadn't taken his clothes with him, and that nightshirt was one of Father's new ones. Bobby remembered its being made just before Peter's birthday. Why hadn't Father taken his clothes? Bobby slipped from the room. As she went, she heard the key turned in the lock of the trunk. Her heart was beating horribly. Why hadn't Father taken his clothes? When Mother came out of the room, Bobby flung tightly clasping arms round her waist and whispered,
Mother, Daddy isn't dead, is he?
My darling, no. What made you think of anything so horrible?
I don't know,
said Bobby, angry with herself, but still clinging to that resolution of hers not to see anything that Mother didn't mean her to see. Mother gave her a hurried hug.
Daddy was quite well when I heard from him last,
she said.
And he'll come back to us some day. Don't fancy such horrible things, darling.
Later on, when the Russian stranger had been made comfortable for the night, Mother came into the girl's room. She was to sleep there in Phyllis's bed, and Phyllis was to have a mattress on the floor, a most amusing adventure for Phyllis. Directly Mother came in, two white figures started up, and two eager voices called,
Now, Mother, tell us all about the Russian gentleman.
A white shape hopped into the room. It was Peter, dragging his quilt behind him like the tail of a white peacock.
We have been patient,
he said.
And I had to bite my tongue not to go to sleep, and I just nearly went to sleep, and I bit too hard, and it hurts ever so. Do tell us. Make a nice long story of it.
I can't make a long story of it tonight,
said Mother.
I'm very tired.
Bobby knew by her voice that Mother had been crying, but the others didn't know.
Well, make it as long as you can,
said Phil, and Bobby got her arms round Mother's waist and snuggled close to her.
Well, it's a story long enough to make a whole book of. He's a writer. He's written beautiful books. In Russia, at the time of the Tsar, one dared not say anything about the rich people doing wrong, or about the things that ought to be done to make poor people better and happier. If one did, one was sent to prison.
But they can't,
said Peter.
People only go to prison when they've done wrong.
Or when the judges think they've done wrong,
said Mother.
Yes, that's so in England. But in Russia it was different. And he wrote a beautiful book about poor people and how to help them. I've read it. There's nothing in it but goodness and kindness, and they sent him to prison for it. He was 3 years in a horrible dungeon, with hardly any light, and all damp and dreadful. In prison, all alone, for 3 years.
Mother's voice trembled a little and stopped suddenly.
But Mother,
said Peter,
that can't be true now. It sounds like something out of a history book, the Inquisition or something.
It was true,
said Mother.
It's all horribly true. Well, then they took him out and sent him to Siberia, a convict, chained to other convicts, wicked men who'd done all sorts of crimes, a long chain of them, and they walked and walked and walked for days and weeks, till he thought they'd never stop walking. And overseers went behind them with whips, yes, whips, to beat them if they got tired. And some of them went lame, and some fell down, and when they couldn't get up and go on, they beat them, and then left them to die. Oh, it's all too terrible. And at last he got to the mines, and he was condemned to stay there for life, just for writing a good, noble, splendid book.
How did he get away?
When the war came, some of the Russian prisoners were allowed to volunteer as soldiers, and he volunteered, but he deserted at the first chance he got, and—
But that's very cowardly, isn't it?
said Peter.
To desert? Especially when it's war.
Do you think he owed anything to a country that had done that to him? If he did, he owed more to his wife and children. He didn't know what had become of them.
Oh,
cried Bobby.
He had them to think about and be miserable about too, then, all the time he was in prison.
Yes, he had them to think about and be miserable about all the time he was in prison. For anything he knew, they might have been sent to prison too. They did those things in Russia. But while he was in the mines, some friends managed to get a message to him that his wife and children had escaped and come to England. So when he deserted, he came here to look for them.
Had he got their address?
said practical Peter.
No, just England. He was going to London, and he thought he had to change at our station. And then he found he'd lost his ticket and his purse.
Oh, do you think he'll find them? I mean his wife and children, not the ticket and things.
I hope so. Oh, I hope and pray that he'll find his wife and children again.
Even Phyllis now perceived that Mother's voice was very unsteady.
Why, Mother,
she said.
How very sorry you seem to be for him.
Mother didn't answer for a minute. Then she just said,
Yes.
And then she seemed to be thinking. The children were quiet. Presently she said,
Dears, when you say your prayers, I think you might ask God to show his pity upon all prisoners and captives.
To show his pity,
Bobby repeated slowly.
Upon all prisoners and captives. Is that right, Mother?
Yes,
said Mother.
Upon all prisoners and captives. All prisoners and captives.
End of chapter 5. Chapter 6 of The Railway Children. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Railway Children by Edith Nesbit. Chapter 6. Saviours of the Train. The Russian gentleman was better the next day, and the day after that better still, and on the third day he was well enough to come into the garden. A basket chair was put for him, and he sat there dressed in clothes of father's, which were too big for him. But when Mother had hemmed up the ends of the sleeves and the trousers, The clothes did well enough. His was a kind face, now that it was no longer tired and frightened, and he smiled at the children whenever he saw them. They wished very much that he could speak English. Mother wrote several letters to people she thought might know whereabouts in England a Russian gentleman's wife and family might possibly be. Not to the people she used to know before she came to live at Three Chimneys. She never wrote to any of them, but strange people, members of Parliament and editors of papers and secretaries of societies. And she did not do much of her story writing, only corrected proofs, as she sat in the sun near the Russian and talked to him every now and then. The children wanted very much to show how kindly they felt to this man who had been sent to prison and to Siberia just for writing a beautiful book about poor people. They could smile at him, of course. They could, and they did. But if you smile too constantly, the smile is apt to get fixed, like the smile of the hyena, and then it no longer looks friendly, but simply silly. So they tried other ways, and brought him flowers till the place where he sat was surrounded by little fading bunches of clover and roses and Canterbury bells. And then Phyllis had an idea. She beckoned mysteriously to the others and drew them into the backyard, and there, in a concealed spot, between the pump and the water butt, she said,
"You remember Perks promising me the very first strawberries out of his own garden?"
Perks, you will recollect, was the porter.
"Well, I should think they're right now. Let's go down and see."
Mother had been down, as she had promised, to tell the station-master the story of the Russian prisoner, but even the charms of the railway had been unable to tear the children away from the neighbourhood of the interesting stranger, so they had not been to the station for 3 days. They went now, and, to their surprise and distress, were very coldly received by Perks.
"Highly honoured, I'm sure,"
he said, when they peeped in at the door of the porter's room, and he went on reading his newspaper. There was an uncomfortable silence.
"Oh dear,"
said Bobby with a sigh.
"I do believe you're cross."
"What, me? Not me,"
said Perks loftily.
"It ain't nothing to me."
What ain't nothing to you?
said Peter, too anxious and alarmed to change the form of words.
"Nothing ain't nothing. What happens either here or elsewhere,"
said Perks.
"If you likes to have your secrets, have 'em and welcome. That's what I say."
The secret chamber of each heart was rapidly examined during the pause that followed. 3 heads were shaken.
"We haven't got any secrets from you,"
said Bobby at last.
"Maybe you have, and maybe you haven't,"
said Perks.
"It ain't nothing to me, and I wish you all a very good afternoon."
He held up the paper between him and them, and went on reading.
"Oh, don't!"
said Phyllis in despair.
"This is truly dreadful. Whatever it is, do tell us."
"We didn't mean to do it, whatever it was."
No answer. The paper was refolded, and Perks began on another column.
"Look here,"
said Peter suddenly.
"it's not fair. Even people who do crimes aren't punished without being told what it's for, as once they were in Russia."
"I don't know nothing about Russia."
"Oh, yes, you do, when Mother came down on purpose to tell you and Mr. Gills all about our Russian."
"Can't you fancy it?"
said Perks indignantly.
"Don't you see him asking of me to step into his room and take a chair and listen to what her ladyship has to say?"
"Do you mean to say you've not heard?"
"Not so much as a breath. I did go so far as to put a question, and he shuts me up like a rat trap. 'Affairs of state, Perks,' says he. But I did think one of you would have nipped down to tell me. You'll hear sharp enough when you want to get anything out of old Perks."
Phyllis flushed purple as she thought of the strawberries.
"Information about locomotives or signals or the likes," said
Perks.
"We didn't know you didn't know."
"We thought Mother had told you."
"We wanted to tell you, only we thought it would be stale news."
The 3 spoke all at once. Perks said it was
all very well,
and still held up the paper. Then Phyllis suddenly snatched it away and threw her arms round his neck.
"Oh, let's kiss and be friends,"
she said.
"We'll say we're sorry first if you like, but we didn't really know that you didn't know."
We are so sorry,
said the others. and Perks at last consented to accept their apologies. Then they got him to come out and sit in the sun on the green railway bank, where the grass was quite hot to touch, and there, sometimes speaking one at a time and sometimes all together, they told the porter the story of the Russian prisoner.
"Well, I must say,"
said Perks, but he did not say it, whatever it was.
Yes, it is pretty awful, isn't it?
Said Peter.
And I don't wonder you were curious about who the Russian was.
"I wasn't curious, not so much as interested,"
said the porter.
Well, I do think Mr. Gills might have told you about it. It was horrid of him.
"I don't keep no down on him for that, missy,"
said the porter.
"'Cause why? I see his reasons. He wouldn't want to give away his own side with a tale like that 'ere. It ain't human nature. A man's got to stand up for his own side, whatever they does. That's what it means by party politics. I should have done the same myself if that long-haired chap had a been a Jap."
But the Japs didn't do cruel, wicked things like that,
said Bobby.
"Perhaps not,"
said Perks cautiously.
"Still, you can't be sure with foreigners. My own belief is that they're all tarred with the same brush."
Then why were you on the side of the Japs?
Peter asked.
"Well, you see, you must take one side or the other, same as with Liberals and Conservatives. The great thing is to take your side and then stick to it, whatever happens."
A signal sounded.
"There's the 314 up,"
said Perks.
"You lie low till she's through, and then we'll go up along to my place and see if there's any of them strawberries ripe what I told you about."
If there are any ripe, and you do give them to me,
said Phyllis,
you won't mind if I give them to the poor Russian, will you?
Perks narrowed his eyes and then raised his eyebrows.
"So it was them strawberries you come down for this afternoon, eh?"
said he. This was an awkward moment for Phyllis. To say
yes
would seem rude and greedy and unkind to Perks, but she knew if she said
no,
she would not be pleased with herself afterwards. So
yes,
she said.
It was.
"Well done," said
the porter.
"Speak the truth and shame the—"
But we'd have come down the very next day if we'd known you hadn't heard the story,"
Phyllis added hastily.
"I believe you, missy,"
said Perks, and sprang across the line, 6 feet in front of the advancing train. The girls hated to see him do this, but Peter liked it. It was so exciting. The Russian gentleman was so delighted with the strawberries that the 3 racked their brains to find some other surprise for him. But all the racking did not bring out any idea more novel than wild cherries, and this idea occurred to them next morning. They had seen the blossom on the trees in the spring, and they knew where to look for wild cherries now that cherry time was here. The trees grew all up and along the rocky face of the cliff, out of which the mouth of the tunnel opened. There were all sorts of trees there, birches and beeches and baby oaks and hazels, and among them the cherry blossom had shone like snow and silver. The mouth of the tunnel was some way from Three Chimneys, so Mother let them take their lunch with them in a basket, and the basket would do to bring the cherries back in, if they found any. She also lent them her silver watch, so that they should not be late for tea. Peter's Waterbury had taken it into its head not to go, since the day when Peter dropped it into the water butt. And they started. When they got to the top of the cutting, they leaned over the fence, and looked down to where the railway lines lay at the bottom of what, as Phyllis said, was exactly like a mountain gorge.
If it wasn't for the railway at the bottom, it would be as though the foot of man had never been there, wouldn't it?
The sides of the cutting were of grey stone, very roughly hewn. Indeed, the top part of the cutting had been a little natural glen that had been cut deeper to bring it down to the level of the tunnel's mouth. Among the rocks, grass and flowers grew, and seeds dropped by birds in the crannies of the stone had taken root and grown into bushes and trees that overhung the cutting. Near the tunnel was a flight of steps leading down to the line, just wooden bars roughly fixed into the earth, a very steep and narrow way, more like a ladder than a stair.
We'd better get down,
said Peter.
I'm sure the cherries would be quite easy to get at from the side of the steps. You remember, it was there we picked the cherry blossoms that we put on the rabbit's grave.
So they went along the fence towards the little swing gate that is at the top of these steps, and they were almost at the gate when Bobby said,
Hush! Stop! What's that?
That was a very odd noise indeed, a soft noise, but quite plainly to be heard through the sound of the wind in tree branches and the hum and whir of the telegraph wires. It was a sort of rustling, whispering sound. As they listened, it stopped, and then it began again. And this time it did not stop, but it grew louder and more rustling and rumbling.
Look!
Cried Peter suddenly.
The tree over there!
The tree he pointed at was one of those that have rough grey leaves and white flowers. The berries, when they come, are bright scarlet, but if you pick them they disappoint you by turning black before you get them home. And, as Peter pointed, the tree was moving. Not just the way trees ought to move when the wind blows through them, but all in one piece, as though it were a live creature and were walking down the side of the cutting.
It's moving!
Cried Bobby.
Oh, look! And so are the others. It's like the woods in Macbeth.
It's magic,
said Phyllis breathlessly.
I always knew this railway was enchanted.
It really did seem a little like magic, for all the trees for about 20 yards of the opposite bank seemed to be slowly walking down towards the railway line, the tree with the grey leaves bringing up the rear, like some old shepherd driving a flock of green sheep.
What is it? Oh, what is it?
Said Phyllis.
It's much too magic for me. I don't like it. Let's go home.
But Bobby and Peter clung fast to the rail and watched breathlessly, and Phyllis made no movement towards going home by herself. The trees moved on and on. Some stones and loose earth fell down and rattled on the railway metals far below.
It's all coming down,
Peter tried to say, but he found there was hardly any voice to say it with. And indeed, just as he spoke, the great rock, on the top of which the walking trees were, leaned slowly forward. The trees, ceasing to walk, stood still and shivered. Leaning with the rock, they seemed to hesitate a moment, and then rock and trees and grass and bushes, with a rushing sound, slipped right away from the face of the cutting and fell on the line with a blundering crash that could have been heard half a mile off. A cloud of dust rose up.
Oh,
said Peter in awe-struck tones.
Isn't it exactly like when the coals come in, if there wasn't any roof to the cellar and you could see down?
Look what a great mound it's made,
said Bobby.
Yes,
said Peter slowly. He was still leaning on the fence.
Yes,
he said again, still more slowly. Then he stood upright.
The 11:29 down hasn't gone by yet. We must let them know at the station, or there'll be a most frightful accident.
Let's run,
said Bobby, and began. But Peter cried,
Come back!
And looked at Mother's watch. He was very prompt and businesslike, and his face looked whiter than they had ever seen it.
No time,
he said.
It's 2 miles away, and it's past 11.
Couldn't we?
Suggested Phyllis breathlessly.
Couldn't we climb up a telegraph post and do something to the wires?
We don't know how,
said Peter.
They do it in war,
said Phyllis.
I know, I've heard of it.
They only cut them, silly,
said Peter.
And that doesn't do any good. And we couldn't cut them even if we got up, and we couldn't get up. If we had anything red, we could get down on the line and wave it.
But the train wouldn't see us till it got round the corner, and then it could see the mound just as well as us,
said Phyllis.
Better, because it's much bigger than us.
If we only had something red,
Peter repeated.
We could go round the corner and wave to the train.
We might wave anyway.
They'd only think it was just us as usual. We've waved so often before. Anyway, let's get down.
They got down the steep stairs. Bobby was pale and shivering. Peter's face looked thinner than usual. Phyllis was red-faced and damp with anxiety.
Oh, how hot I am,
she said.
And I thought it was going to be cold. I wish we hadn't put on our...
She stopped short and then ended in quite a different tone.
Our flannel petticoats.
Bobby turned at the bottom of the stairs.
Oh, yes,
she cried.
They're red. Let's take them off.
They did, and with the petticoats rolled up under their arms, ran along the railway, skirting the newly fallen mound of stones and rock and earth and bent, crushed, twisted trees. They ran at their best pace. Peter led, but the girls were not far behind. They reached the corner that hid the mound from the straight line of railway that ran half a mile without curve or corner.
Now,
said Peter, taking hold of the largest flannel petticoat.
You're not
Phyllis faltered.
going to tear them?
Shut up,
said Peter with brief sternness.
Oh, yes.
Said Bobby.
Tear them into little bits if you like. Don't you see, Phil, if we can't stop the train, there will be a real live accident, with people killed. Oh, horrible! Here, Peter, you'll never tear it through the band.
She took the red flannel petticoat from him and tore it off an inch from the band. Then she tore the other in the same way.
There,
said Peter, tearing in his turn. He divided each petticoat into 3 pieces.
Now, we've got 6 flags.
He looked at the watch again.
And we've got 7 minutes. We must have flagstaffs.
The knives given to boys are, for some odd reason, seldom of the kind of steel that keeps sharp. The young saplings had to be broken off. 2 came up by the roots. The leaves were stripped from them.
We must cut holes in the flags and run the sticks through the holes,
said Peter, and the holes were cut. The knife was sharp enough to cut flannel with. 2 of the flags were set up in heaps of loose stones between the sleepers of the down line. Then Phyllis and Roberta took each a flag and stood ready to wave it as soon as the train came in sight.
I shall have the other 2 myself,
said Peter,
because it was my idea to wave something red.
There are petticoats, though.
Phyllis was beginning, but Bobby interrupted.
Oh, what does it matter who waves what, if we can only save the train?
Perhaps Peter had not rightly calculated the number of minutes it would take the 11:29 to get from the station to the place where they were, or perhaps the train was late. Anyway, it seemed a very long time that they waited. Phyllis grew impatient.
I expect the watch was wrong, and the train's gone by,
said she. Peter relaxed the heroic attitude he had chosen to show off his 2 flags, and Bobby began to feel sick with suspense. It seemed to her that they had been standing there for hours and hours, holding those silly little red flannel flags that no one would ever notice. The train wouldn't care. It would go rushing by them and tear round the corner and go crashing into that awful mound, and everyone would be killed. Her hands grew very cold and trembled so that she could hardly hold the flag. And then came the distant rumble and hum of the metals, and a puff of white steam showed far away along the stretch of line.
Stand firm,
said Peter,
and wave like mad. When it gets to that big furze bush, step back, but go on waving. Don't stand on the line, Bobby.
The train came rattling along very, very fast.
They don't see us. They won't see us. It's all no good,
cried Bobby. The 2 little flags on the line swayed as the nearing train shook and loosened the heaps of loose stones that held them up. One of them slowly leaned over and fell on the line. Bobby jumped forward and caught it up and waved it. Her hands did not tremble now. It seemed that the train came on as fast as ever. It was very near now.
Keep off the line, you silly cuckoo,
said Peter fiercely.
It's no good,
Bobby said again.
Stand back,
cried Peter suddenly, and he dragged Phyllis back by the arm. But Bobby cried,
Not yet, not yet,
and waved her 2 flags right over the line. The front of the engine looked black and enormous. Its voice was loud and harsh.
Oh, stop, stop, stop,
cried Bobby. No one heard her. At least Peter and Phyllis didn't, for the oncoming rush of the train covered the sound of her voice with a mountain of sound. But afterwards she used to wonder whether the engine itself had not heard her. It seemed almost as though it had, for it slackened swiftly, slackened and stopped, not 20 yards from the place where Bobby's 2 flags waved over the line. She saw the great black engine stop dead, but somehow she could not stop waving the flags. And when the driver and the fireman had got off the engine, and Peter and Phyllis had gone to meet them and pour out their excited tale of the awful mound just round the corner, Bobby still waved the flags, but more and more feebly and jerkily. When the others turned towards her, she was lying across the line with her hands flung forward and still gripping the sticks of the little red flannel flags. The engine driver picked her up, carried her to the train, and laid her on the cushions of a first-class carriage.
"Gone right off in a faint,"
he said.
"Poor little woman, and no wonder. I'll just 'ave a look at this 'ere mound of yours, and then we'll run you back to the station and get her seen to."
It was horrible to see Bobby lying so white and quiet, with her lips blue and parted.
I believe that's what people look like when they're dead,
whispered Phyllis.
Don't!
said Peter sharply. They sat by Bobby on the blue cushions, and the train ran back. Before it reached their station, Bobby had sighed and opened her eyes and rolled herself over and begun to cry. This cheered the others wonderfully. They had seen her cry before, but they had never seen her faint, nor anyone else for the matter of that. They had not known what to do when she was fainting, but now she was only crying, they could thump her on the back and tell her not to, just as they always did. And presently, when she stopped crying, they were able to laugh at her for being such a coward as to faint. When the station was reached, the three were the heroes of an agitated meeting on the platform. The praises they got for their
prompt action,
their
common sense,
their
ingenuity
were enough to have turned anybody's head. Phyllis enjoyed herself thoroughly. She had never been a real heroine before, and the feeling was delicious. Peter's ears got very red, yet he too enjoyed himself. Only Bobby wished they all wouldn't. She wanted to get away.
"You'll hear from the company about this, I expect,"
said the station master. Bobby wished she might never hear of it again. She pulled at Peter's jacket.
"Oh, come away, come away. I want to go home,"
she said. So they went, and as they went, station master and porter and guards and driver and fireman and passengers sent up a cheer.
"Oh, listen!"
cried Phyllis.
"That's for us!"
Yes,
said Peter.
I say, I am glad I thought about something red and waving it.
How lucky we did put on our red flannel petticoats,
said Phyllis. Bobby said nothing. She was thinking of the horrible mound and the trustful train rushing towards it.
And it was us that saved them,
said Peter.
How dreadful if they had all been killed,
said Phyllis.
Wouldn't it, Bobby?
We never got any cherries after all,
said Bobby. The others thought her rather heartless. End of chapter 6.